Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. In July of 2022, Rosalynde Welch had the distinct impression while cleaning her house that she should reach out to Kate Holbrook and ask how she could help share more of Kate's own writing and thinking with the world. As many of you know, Kate was a historian, a scholar, and a light to so many lives. She had been previously diagnosed with a rare eye cancer, which had just entered a terminal phase. And as Rosalynde cleaned, it struck her that Kate had spent so much time promoting others' voices, particularly the voices of women, but that the insights of Kate herself needed to be shared and preserved. She reached out immediately, and Kate responded gratefully. Rosalynde and a small team began the urgent work of gathering, compiling, editing, and filling in the gaps of Kate's manuscript to complete what is now the brand new book of her writing, Both Things Are True, which is part of BYU Maxwell Institute's Living Faith series. Kate tragically would pass away only a few weeks after this work began, in August of 2022. And we want to be really clear about this. This is a really special book. What comes shining through so clearly is Kate's gentle nature alongside her backbone of steel, as Rosalynde puts it. And perhaps more than anything, her authentic discipleship. As the book's title indicates, it wrestles with what Joseph Smith calls contraries, how the church can be both true and open to further truth, and how what Kate calls the crucible of housework can bring about a sense of both inadequacy and divinity. And true to Kate's hope that she be remembered for her recipes, the book ends with Kate's own recipe for what we can confirm is the perfect chocolate bundt cake. Our guest, Rosalynde, is an incredibly insightful scholar who currently works as a senior research fellow at the Maxwell Institute. She's also the new host of the Maxwell Institute podcast since March of this year, which is a resource that we can't recommend strongly enough. All right, thanks so much as always for listening, and with that, we'll jump right in. Okay, well, Rosalynde, thank you so much for being here with us. We're excited to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here, mostly to talk about my friend Kate and this beautiful book that she's written.
Yeah, I read most of this book on the most beautiful rainy day, and that just felt like the perfect fit. There was really something so special and a real bittersweetness maybe about this book. And I don't know if it's the love and the clarity that you would expect from the end of a very good life, but you can really sense that in the whole book. And so it was just a really beautiful experience to get to read this and think of her. And we're just so grateful for your contributions, and we're so excited to talk about Kate. And I would love to just start, if you could just tell the story about how you even got involved in this project.
Yeah. I met Kate many years ago now. I knew her husband, Sam, better first. He and I had been connected through different academic projects, and our fields are a little closer together than Kate's and mine were. But she, as was typical of her, she noticed me. I lived in St. Louis at the time, so it was far from kind of the center of Latter-day Saint studies, and I was an independent scholar. So I had a PhD and was trying to work in my field, but I didn't have an academic affiliation. I wasn't employed by a university, and that's kind of a marginalized position in the academic world. Now, I was incredibly grateful, and at every point in my own journey, I've had wonderful mentors who have seen me and reached out to me. So it actually worked out beautifully for me, but Kate was one of those. So I think she saw me and thought, here is a woman that I can bring in and can share the connections that I have and the resources that I have with her. So she invited me to come out and be a part of a conference that she and Matt Bowman put on a number of years ago on Latter-day Saint women's history. But when I first got to know her was when we both were invited to advise the Maxwell Institute. Right now, I work for the Maxwell Institute, but for many years, I just advised on the advisory committee. And so Kate and I were, in particular, we worked together on the imprint board. So we would read manuscripts that came through, and we would advise the Institute on whether or not they should be published. And Melissa Inouye served for a long time on that board as well. So we had seen that there was a huge imbalance in the number of male-authored and female-authored manuscripts that came through that we could consider. So even though we wanted to elevate women's voices, we still had a really embarrassing lack of female-authored books in the Maxwell Institute catalog. So Kate and Melissa worked hard to find a way to remedy that, as they both do, right? They just sort of see a problem, find a way to fix it and tackle it. So they came up with a really great initiative to support women in authoring their manuscripts, and we're seeing that bear fruit. But so Kate and I had worked together in that capacity for a while. And I had known that that Kate had battled cancer for many years, and I had been aware of that, but wasn't in her inner circle. So about a year ago, in July of 2022, I had actually just moved to Utah, just moved to Provo. I'd gotten a new job at the Maxwell Institute. And I remember it so clearly. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in my new house just cleaning it. It was in that honeymoon stage when you're in a new house and you want it to look sparkling and beautiful all the time. So I was going to clean my house from top to bottom. It was going to shine and sparkle. And I decided to put on a podcast to keep me company, as I often do. And I don't know how I landed on this particular podcast, but somehow I landed on an old Maxwell Institute podcast that Kate and a scholar named Jenny Reeder had done with Blair Hodges, who at the time was the host of the Maxwell Institute podcast. And it was about a book that Kate and Jenny edited together called At the Pulpit, 185, pretty sure that's the number, 185 years of Latter-day Saint women's discourses. And they were talking about this wonderful editorial work. They had gone through the archives and discovered all these hidden gems and then had edited them and polished them. So they were just shining and sparkling in this beautiful volume. And Kate said something that struck me with a kind of force that I can't really explain. And I know exactly what the words are because they are the words that I open the introduction to the book with. And here's what Kate said. She said, "This is a collection of women speaking about themselves, their own religious thinking in their own voices." And it came to me so strongly in that moment that we hadn't heard much of Kate's own religious thinking in her own voice. She had spent her life discovering and elevating other women's voices and other women's thinking, and that was her glory and her work. But I felt that she had something to say herself, and those words really came to my heart in a way that is unusual for me. I am not a deeply spiritual person, although I'm firmly committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ and born and bred as a Latter-day Saint and have committed my life to it. But I'm not somebody who often receives extremely strong spiritual promptings. So it was extremely out of the ordinary for me to have such a strong prompting come to me in that moment. And it was, you need to reach out to Kate and ask her how you can help her get her writing out there. And I didn't really want to do that for a couple of reasons. I thought it would be very awkward to bring up the idea that her life might be getting short. I didn't know how to broach that in a way. She was very, very private about her illness, and we had never spoken openly about it, and I was uncomfortable even bringing up the idea. And I also felt dumb because I didn't really know what I could offer to do. How would I help her? But all day long, as I mopped my floor, and then I was vacuuming my stairs, and then I was cleaning the basement, and the thought came back and back. You need to email Kate today, and you need to tell her that you want to help her get her own writing out there. What I didn't know is that she already had a manuscript in the works. In fact, she had already been speaking with Miranda Wilcox, who is such an important figure in this whole story. Miranda is the editor of the Maxwell Institute's Living Faith series. And so she had already been talking with Kate about a potential book, and Kate already had the germ of an idea that she had been developing. I knew nothing about that. And just that afternoon, she and Sam had gotten some sobering medical news, and it became very clear to both of them that indeed it was not a matter of years, and it might not even be a matter of months. and that Kate really needed to prioritize what she wanted to spend her time on during her remaining weeks or days on Earth. So that afternoon, she and Sam had sat down to make a list of what projects she was working on and how they could be completed. And she received, as they were in that process, this email that I sent to her, offering to help in any way that I could. And she took the timing of that as a kind of sign that she should accept my help. She was one who was slow to accept help, although very quick to offer it. But I think she felt that the timing of the communication was a sign. She was one who was so attuned to the spiritual dimension of life, and she saw meaning in the things that happened to her. So she emailed me right back and said, I would love your help. I am developing a manuscript. I have 5 chapters, but all of them need to be revised. I've sent one of them off to an editor already, the wonderful editor, Jana Reese.
Yes.
She's
Jana's
great.
amazing.
Yeah. And she said, Jana has sent back comments. Could you just take a look at those comments and maybe implement them, right? I don't have the bandwidth to go through and make the suggested revisions. Could you give that a try? And so, of course, I was happy to do that. And that started a kind of training period for Kate and for me. And it didn't last very long, but I took that chapter and I took Jana's wonderful comments and suggestions, and I revised according to them, sometimes writing in Kate's voice, sometimes writing just in a more neutral, scholarly voice. And I added a few things here and there, and then I sent it back to Kate. And I actually never heard back from her whether or not she liked it, but she sent me another chapter. So I took that as a sign that she was comfortable with the work that I was doing. So Kate was able to get comfortable, and I was able to get comfortable with the process of me trying to deeply understand her points and her perspective, and then trying to express them in a way that did justice and honor to her own unique vision. Those weeks passed very quickly during the summer of 2022, and very soon she was no longer able to really engage in any way at all. And in the last days of her life, so fortunately through the efforts of Miranda, we were able to get our hands on all those chapters that she had planned. We didn't even have all the files for a long time, but she was able to send those over. And then she was able to communicate what her hopes were for this manuscript, which is that I would sort of take the lead as the writing voice with the aid of the wonderful Miranda Wilcox, and then her good friend Jenny Pulsifer, who had been in a writing group with her for a long time and really knew Kate's voice and would kind of help to make sure that it sounded like Kate. And so the 3 of us, again, with real important assist from Jana Reese in those early stages, agreed to take this project on after Kate's life ended.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm curious how you make sense of the fact that you were doing this housework when this prompting came to you, because there's an entire chapter, and Kate thought and wrote a lot about housework. There's this chapter, housework as a crucible of discipleship. Have you processed that fact and felt spiritually connected to her for that reason?
I have. She and I, in some ways, her worldview and my worldview are actually quite different, which is why it was really an amazingly broadening experience to so deeply inhabit her mind, which, as I said, is so close to the spirit, so close to the spirits of her foremothers and her forefathers. And the veil is very, very thin for Kate. But where we are alike is that we share a deep love for domestic life, and for gardening and for children. I'm not nearly the cook that she was, but I do take a lot of joy in cooking for my family. So yes, that's something that we shared in common. And I've thought about this whole experience has been a really profound demonstration of the Latter-day Saint teaching about proxy action, right? And of course, it's ritualized and formalized in the temple and in proxy ordinances. But I've come to understand that I think it's something that's much deeper than that we are a part of each other in other times and other places as well. And I have thought maybe the reason why in that moment I was able to receive a kind of prompting that was very unusual for me, but very common for Kate. She talks about receiving these kinds of strong impressions and strong directive promptings in her professional work, in her personal life. Maybe there's a way in which she and I were connected more deeply than we thought. And we were connected, just as you say, Tim, by the kind of everyday embodied physical world that we live in. So it's a spiritual connection, but it's grounded, I think, in our bodies, and especially in the most everyday relationality and work and experience of what we do in this physical world and how we make our way through it. And again, to me, that's just deeply suggestive of our teachings about the embodied and yet spiritual connection that we experience through these proxy actions in the temple.
Oh my gosh, I love that. It's just one more example of both things being true.
Yeah.
This embodiment and also spirituality, and that you lean on both.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the title and maybe just why she choose this title and what does it mean?
Yeah, she did choose the title. So not this title. Originally, the title that she had in mind was Two Things Are True. Two Things Are True. And that has a nice kind of alliterative, rhyming sound to it. And then in the editing process, our Deseret book editor, Lisa Roper, said, I think that both things are true, kind of better communicates what she was getting at. And we agreed with that. So we changed it to both things are true. But this was Kate's idea from the beginning. And she wanted every chapter to be structured in the same way around two ideas, both of which are true and powerful and galvanizing, but exist in a kind of tension with each other and aren't easily reconciled. And it wasn't really a project about reconciling disparate truths. It was more about opening up the space and finding a way to live as a disciple between those two truths. She didn't quote Joseph Smith, but he was in my mind, this famous, what's become a kind of aphorism for Latter-day Saints, that by proving contraries, truth is made manifest. So we weren't trying to reconcile them or work it all out with a tidy bow, but Kate was trying to show us what it looks like to live in the space between those tensions. Now, some of the chapters came already structured in that way, especially the fourth chapter, which is about forgiveness and accountability. Mm-hmm. And from the very beginning, she had conceived that as an exploration of this tension between the Christian command to forgive 70 times 7 and more, and the reality that as an historian, she was especially attuned to, that accountability is necessary. And without accountability, history shows that injustices will be repeated. So how do we live there as Christians between the need to forgive and the need to hold people accountable? And it's a beautiful exploration of that.
Yeah. Before we get into, and we want to get into lots of these ideas in the book, but I want to ask one question that sort of on the more meta level, and that's about Kate's character. I think both Aubrey and I wish that we had gotten to know Kate better. We only had a few small interactions with her, but she comes across to me in this book as an exceedingly gentle person who is completely incapable of spiritually pummeling anyone, past or present. She seems to work with sort of precision tools and takes great care to do no harm to anyone, even as she addresses things like forgiveness and accountability. Yeah. To what extent, to what extent do you think that's true? And did that influence you as you dived into her writing?
That is exactly who Kate was. And what's so interesting is that it was not only a personal kind of characteristic of her. If you ever met her, she was incredibly gracious and warm and unselfish and inviting. But it was a professional standard of hers as well. She was an historian of women's experience, and she wrote her dissertation on the Nation of Islam and Latter-day Saint foodways. So these two kind of religiously and socially marginalized groups. And on top of that, looking at an aspect of their collective experience that doesn't typically receive a lot of professional respect, right? Which is just food and recipes and eating. But what motivated her as an historian was to tell these stories from the inside out. And she firmly believed that every person experiences their own life with dignity and with meaning. And sometimes that's not visible from the outside, but she was determined that she would do enough digging to get to the inside of their experience so that she could tell it in a way that readers would understand why their life was meaningful. No matter how invisible to the large forces of history this person might be, to them, their perspective was necessarily the center of the universe. And she wanted to make that visible to readers as well. So it was not only who she was as a person, it was who she was as an historian. But at the same time, I'll also say she had a backbone of steel. And her ability to inhabit other people's perspectives, in that, sometimes you can get lost in that, right? We talk about empathy a lot, and empathy is great, but sometimes you can get lost in empathy, and the other person's perspective comes to dominate the whole universe. And in a way, that's just as atomizing as when you're lost in your own perspective. So although she had this remarkable ability to get into other people's experience from the inside, she never lost sight of the overarching picture. And when something was unjust or wrong, even if she could see it from the other side, she didn't back down. And as you say, she had precision tools. She had an incredible ability to build trust. So she never had to bludgeon anybody. She never had to coerce or force her way, but she didn't stop and she didn't give up when something needed to be fixed.
Wow. And
that's something that Melissa Inouye, who worked with her at Church History Department, has seen even closer up than I have, but it really comes through in the book as well. You almost don't realize what's happening because she does it. She leads you along so gently, but she's making extremely strong and salient points about justice.
Yeah. Well, and you really begin to trust her too, because you can tell that that's the work that she's doing first. It really comes across in each context, in a personal way, but in also these historical contexts.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the first essay? The first one is called "I Belong to the True and Living Church," and I know that phrase can, give people a lot of energy one way or another, and so this was very interesting. And one thing that she wrote right off the bat that really got my attention is that she says, "I believe that there's something aspirational about calling the church true, that we members have a commission to make it true."
Yeah.
So could you just talk about that, and what does she mean by that? What's aspirational, and how can we be a part of truth?
Yeah. So I think it's important just to establish at the outset that Kate, in many ways, had a very traditional Latter-day Saint testimony. She was a firm believer in the truth claims of the church. She believed in the Book of Mormon. She believed in prophetic authority. She believed in priesthood authority and the importance of the ordinances. So in all of those ways, she treasured those doctrines, and she believed that the Latter-day Saint tradition does have a kind of unique access to God's sealing power, that we have a special commission to exercise. So in that sense, she kind of has a very traditional testimony. But as you say, Aubrey, she opens with an anecdote about a young recent convert, college-age recent convert, who has a testimony, is about to go away to college, and isn't exactly sure how to communicate this aspect of the church's self-concept, because it can feel arrogant and it can feel exclusive. Say that we're the true church and there are no other true churches. And so she wants to walk in that tension between her very traditional convictions and this reality that we want to acknowledge, accept, and invite truth from wherever it comes. And at the same time, we're not perfect, right? As the body of Christ, we're not perfect yet. So she comes up with this wonderful idea, as you say, that there's this aspirational quality. And when we testify that I know the church is true, part of what we're saying is that I am committed to making the church true. And how does that work? As a rank and file Latter-day Saint, I don't get to control the doctrines, the normative doctrines, right? That's a stewardship that belongs to church leaders. So in what sense then can I make the church true? Well, as Kate teaches us, each one of us can make the church true by bringing ourselves into true and truer relationship to one another. So the truth of the church, her insight is that the truth of the church is not only in its teachings and its doctrines, but it's in the relationships of its members. And that's where, as rank and file members, we can exercise our stewardships to make the church true by being in a true and loving relationship to one another in our families and in our wards, and much further flung than just our local wards, right? She strongly believed that we have a responsibility to know and to seek out the stories of saints in other parts of the world, or saints just across the neighborhood who have an extremely different experience than ours, whether because of socioeconomic or racial factors. That by bringing ourselves into true relationship with God and with our fellows, we make the church true and truer.
And she also sort of makes the point that the church cannot not be true if it's based on the principle that it accepts all truth as truth and discards all error once it's discovered as error. And she makes the argument that that's what prophets have taught, from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young to President Nelson. Is that right? That's
right. She comes up with this wonderful metaphor of a storehouse. And then later on, Miranda Wilcox and she just kind of mentioned the idea of a storehouse, the church as a storehouse for truth. And so later on, Miranda Wilcox and I were looking for more material that we could use to kind of build out this idea and clarify it and expand it. And we looked to her dissertation. And as I already mentioned that, and she wrote about Relief Society sisters who in the early days of the church were given the commission to figure out how to grow wheat, and then in particular, how to store wheat to save it up for times of famine. And so she traces the history of that program. And she sees how indeed Latter-day Saints, the sisters worked to bring wheat into the storehouse, but then it freely flowed out. And it flowed out not only to Latter-day Saints, but to San Francisco and many far-flung locations where this wheat was needed. It would go out. So that really helped me clarify her idea of the storehouse as the place that doesn't only let things in, but it lets things out as well. And as a church, we bring in all that is good, truth from all corners is welcome, and we will preserve it, and we will recognize it, we will take care of it. And when need be, we will expel what is false. And a storehouse, its doors are open also to send out what needs to go away. And sometimes there are things that need to go away. This is what Brigham Young himself said, right? That we will expel all error when we're made aware of it.
Yeah. And even President Nelson, I believe, wasn't there a quote in that speech that he gave dedicating
the life science building?
That there is no conflict between science and religion. It's if there is, it's based on error, a misunderstanding of one or the other, sort of implying that there can be, even in our church, a misunderstanding of religious principles.
That's right. It's that same idea.
Yeah. I feel like this chapter was really important to me. I think maybe just because there have definitely been seasons in my life where I had a real preoccupation with knowing the church is true in the very conventional way. And I feel like for me, the antidote has really been this sort of shift in focus on finding truth in my relationships, like you said, and like building these relationships that are so nourishing in my church community and outside. Like I think the church is helping me to do that better. But then also in this paradigm that it is also my job to gather truth and to be searching. And so I felt like she sort of brought that all together for me. And I liked redefining knowing the church is true as sort of just this commitment to finding truth in these beautiful relationships and in objective truth that is in the world, but not necessarily totally contained within our own gospel. So I like that, maybe it was like I was stepping back and I could see that Kate has this firm belief in like the most conventional way, in a way that like I had always wanted. Yeah. And also was so validating that that's not the only thing that makes this church true, and that maybe even these other things can stand alone if they need to. Yeah. And it also felt like direction. Like this is how you can nourish those other parts of truth that can feed your soul and help be a vehicle for connection to God.
And there's this really beautiful anecdote that she shares. She originally shared it in an article that she and her husband Sam wrote for the Liahona magazine, but we incorporated it here into this chapter, and it gets at exactly what you're saying, Aubrey. She tells a story about one Sunday in her sacrament meeting, a young woman woman had the assignment to give a talk. And so she walks up to the pulpit and she stands there, and it's just dumbstruck with stage fright and with fear of public speaking in front of these people. And she kind of stands there just totally unable to speak or to move, just paralyzed for a few moments. And then the members of her young women class, one by one, walk up to the podium, and they surround her, and they touch her and give her that physical support that she needs, and then she's able to speak. And it, like you say, in that moment, what that young woman was going to say is one thing, right? And I'm not sure if Kate even tells us what she said, but presumably she was going to testify of the doctrines of the gospel, right? And those are valuable and true. But what was the real testimony in that moment? What was the real manifestation of the truth of the church? It wasn't in what the young woman was going to say. It was in those bonds of fellowship.
Yeah. It struck me, that story, that was maybe my favorite moment in the book. And it struck me that those young women were living atonement in the most real, like in two very real senses, that they were becoming sort of at one with each other, which I think is a big part of it. And in the sense that atonement does turn what could be a very ugly experience into something truly beautiful. It's like that sort of alchemy and transformation that seems impossible through any other means. And so I was so glad that was included. It was really moving.
Yeah.
And it sort of centers you on, okay, this is what truth should feel like. So when you feel that arrogance or exclusivity, you know, like something's a little bit off. Like this is the feeling of being in total alignment with God. And I love that she included that story because it was just beautiful. Yeah. Let's see, maybe before we move on from this, can you talk about fidelity? Because I think that's a word that kind of helps you remember what we mean by true.
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting emphasis.
Yeah, she likes this word fidelity as a way to explain just what we've been talking about. What does it mean to have faith in the church, right? And so one way to understand, you know, our faith or our testimony in the gospel is sort of as belief, right? As kind of intellectual assent to its propositions. And again, let me emphasize, Kate intellectually assented to the truth claims of the church. But she wants to explore another aspect of faith, right? Not faith as belief, but faith as fidelity, as a kind of personal loyalty and a personal trust that we feel ideally, you know, to our brothers and sisters in our local congregations, also to our general leaders, to our prophet and apostles and general authorities. And it's a kind of faithfulness that's modeled on the fidelity of husband and wife one to another. And it's a kind of very rich and deep blend of commitment, of love, of trust, of loyalty, and of forgiveness, right? All of those are kind of blended together, I think, for Kate in this idea of fidelity. And fidelity then kind of describes the character or the quality of the relationship that we have to the body of Christ.
Yeah.
I like that metaphor of a relationship because I think it also kind of implies that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any sort of suppression going on, or that someone is in a one-up position, or that you're always going to agree. I like that in a relationship, to be genuinely supportive of each other, there would be tension sometimes. And that doesn't mean that the relationship is broken. That can actually mean that there's a lot of health there.
Yes.
But that's so complicated in a church situation where you have an explicit authority with stewardship. And so can you, and of course you can't speak for Kate, and I would love to just hear your own thoughts too, but what do you think that tension can look like in a way that is healthy and nourishing of this truth and not out of alignment with this thing that we're really trying to center on, but that also doesn't, cause separation.
Yeah. So for instance, like if you are in a ward and you have very, very deep differences of opinion with fellow ward members, that what you're thinking of, or maybe you strongly disagree with something that a prophet or apostle has said, something like that. Yeah. Well, you know, I myself am in a mixed political orientation marriage. And so maybe for me, this kind of just seems like it just has become a matter of course for me that my closest intimate life partner, my husband, whom I love and whom we've built this life together, we we see things differently and we act politically sometimes in different ways. And I've just come to, be able to cope with it. I think it's because my husband and I see ourselves as united and jointly working together towards a larger goal that we do share, right? Which of course is the raising of our children. The parental relationship draws forth our greatest efforts and our deepest feelings and our greatest anguishes. And we have bonded together and been together in that project. So these other differences, while real, don't seem decisive or definitive. And I wonder if a similar dynamic might be at play. I remember an experience where I was primary president, which is a really very unusual calling in one particular sense. There's a woman who actually has stewardship over men under her, right? I don't think that happens in any other situation, but I was a primary president. And so I had stewardship over the male primary teachers and the Cub Scout program. So I remember having a meeting with the Cub Scout den leader, and we were talking about whom we should, call. And he said something about, well, we really want to get women because they don't work. And so they have more time to devote to this. And I had a problem with that. A, many of them do work. B, our time is not any less valuable. But it bothered me. Like, it really bothered me in that moment. I'm a pretty agreeable person. So, in the flow of the conversation, I kind of, I said, yeah, but at the same time, and we worked through it. But I did harbor a little something like, this guy, he obviously doesn't value the work that I do, but I observed him working in that calling as den leader. And I love children. Children, for me, are where I experience God. So anytime that I see children learning, being nurtured, being led, growing, I'm going to be able to feel the Spirit and see the power of God at work. And I saw it in the way that he worked in a dedicated and wonderful way with those children. And because the two of us were engaged in this larger project that meant a lot to me, it became easy to set aside what had been a hurtful comment and persisted as a genuine difference between us. But we had a larger goal that we were working on together. And I wonder if in some ways that's how we can work through some of these difficult challenges, is identify what we share in common with our church leaders, for instance, right? Which I think is the vision of Zion, the vision of the beloved community where all flourish. That's what they want. That's what we want. There might be a difference of opinion as to how that comes to be, but I think focusing on the larger vision and the shared project can show us how to get beyond the differences that persist.
I love that. Like backbone of steel and shared values and a lot of grace. Yeah. Because we're a mess. We're all a mess. Sorry, I was just going to say that reminds me and then maybe that brings us to the next chapter, the revelation process. There's a part where Kate talks about how some people just feel like they have access to personal revelation. And it's like you said about her, it's just kind of flowing and they always feel open to it. And that's how it's guiding their life. And other people have other gifts. And maybe that's why they don't feel this constant flow of revelation. And I loved remembering that maybe there's not a deficit here. Maybe it is something to be developed, but also maybe you're responsible for bringing another perspective that wouldn't be there otherwise. And I just loved remembering that, like, that's one of the really healthy things about community, that you're going to have people who have different gifts and that's a reason to trust yourself and also to give a lot of grace and respect to people who have a totally different set of spiritual gifts that they're working with.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, yeah, I was just going to say, let's talk about this next chapter. Yeah. Revelation is a process. Maybe you could explore a little bit within the general thesis of the book. What are the two things that are true as it pertains to Revelation? What is that polarity?
Yeah. Kate, as Aubrey just alluded to, she had a firm conviction that God is at work in the world. He's at work in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's at work outside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he's at work in each one of us. So the first thing is that revelation is real. God exists. We can come into his presence and we can know and be known of him. The second thing that is true is that it's really hard. That is a really difficult process. And just because it's a divine process and just because it's a real process doesn't mean that it's not going to be messy, that it's not going to be painful, that it's not going to be time consuming. And we shouldn't take those obstacles as evidence that the process isn't working or that the process isn't real. On the contrary, right? We should see that as evidence that something is happening. There's friction because something is moving, right? Something dynamic is happening between us and God. But she uses these really wonderful examples from church history. Aurelia Rogers, who sort of had the vision for the primary program, right? And as she felt enlivened and invigorated, the Spirit was just flowing through her as the ideas were initially coming. But then as time passed, Sister Rogers actually fell into this kind of darkness and a deep depression. And she really wondered, if the Spirit is working through me, why am I feeling that way? And there's no magic answer to that. Kate doesn't have a magic answer, but she says, as we've already talked about a little bit, our bodies are involved in this process. It's not just a kind of mental, mind to mind or spirit to spirit. Our bodies are deeply involved in the process of receiving revelation. And sometimes that means that we experience the highs and the lows of embodied beings as a part of revelation. She talks about Ardith Kapp, who was the visionary leader who designed the Young Women program as it used to be. Now it's changed again, but the values-based personal progress program. And she worked tirelessly on that, but ran into the inevitable realities of life in a big bureaucratic institution, which is like there were lots of levels of approvals and people didn't see things her way. And it felt like it was a never-ending process to get this thing finally approved and through. But again, she didn't give up and didn't take that as a sign that inspiration wasn't real. Instead, she pushed through.
Yeah. You've described just in this conversation yourself as a person who perhaps rarely feels very strong spiritual prompting. So I'm curious if sort of reading Kate's writing and filling out some of Kate's writing here, if it was especially as it pertains to the difficulty of revelation, if it especially resonated or if it was difficult for you to process, or what were your personal feelings as you went through this material?
In so many ways, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Yes, Kate's worldview and her religious experience was very, very different from mine, but surprisingly, it was incredibly easy for me to slip into it. And I don't say this in a kind of, I never felt Kate's presence in the room. I never kind of heard her voice in my ears. I kind of went back to my old ways after my one, thunderbolt of inspiration on that July day in my kitchen. I didn't feel her in a kind of supernatural way. But in the ways that we were talking about, I felt like I was able to be in her and to be in her mind and in her spirit in a way that felt very authentic and very enlarging, right? And the certainties that she has, I'm able to rest in them, even if they aren't given to me fully transparently myself. But I can rest in them. There's one passage that I really, really love in the Revelation chapter, and I mention it in the introduction. I come back to it again and again and again as I was working on editing and writing the rest of the book. But she's talking about Revelation. She's talking about the gathering of Israel and how this has been a big priority for President Nelson. And so she's trying to think about how Revelation bears on the gathering of Israel. And so she thinks about this place that she loves. She cites a beautiful verse from 1 Nephi about God gathering his children from the four quarters of the earth, numbering his sheep, and they know him. They shall be one fold and one shepherd. He shall feed his sheep, and in them they shall find pasture. And then she speaks more personally, and she says this. This is on page 68 of the book. There is a pasture I love that I visit every summer. Horses and cows graze there. The sky, mountains, meadow, trees, and streams are beautiful. The air is clear. The animals have all that they need, and they are safe there. To have all of us in a safe and beautiful place where we are known, seen, and cared for, I want to be in that place and I want to help others find it. When I read that passage, to me, yes, it speaks of Revelation, but more than anything, it speaks to me of where Kate is now, and it speaks to me of her continued existence, what it means, what it meant to her to be gathered in Christ, to be brought home to her Maker and to her heavenly parents. And that pasture is the context where I think of her and I feel her and I imagine her. And that's very easy for me to do in a way that I can't really explain, because I myself am not one whose spiritual gift is a strong conviction of an afterlife and a really strong expectation or understanding of what comes after this life. For me, it's a very dark veil. And yet it's easy for me to rest in Kate's certainty here. And I feel no conflict. I feel no conflict between our perspectives. And I think that has something to do with what it means to be one with each other in Christ. It doesn't erase our differences and it doesn't give us the same mind, but I think it allows us to rest in one another's experience in that way.
I really appreciated her perspective in this chapter as a historian, because she writes about the history of Revelation and the way that Revelation has been recorded over time, and how that may be still affecting the way we expect God to communicate with us, and that maybe that's the part that makes it difficult. And that there were also these wilderness seasons like the children of Israel experienced, and that's just as true. It just wasn't just as true that we wrote it all down.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you have thought about the ways, do we still do that? Do we still record maybe orally over the pulpit in fast and testimony meeting? Are we still recording these Revelation histories in a way that sort of omits the wilderness season? And how could we do that better so that it doesn't feel like something's gone wrong when we're experiencing that?
Yeah. There's such a strong pull. It's almost like the force of genre, right? I'm a literary scholar, so genre is like the type of story that you're telling, like a fairy tale. And if you let's say that your daughter asks you at night, like, Daddy, will you tell me a bedtime story? Chances are you're going to start out once upon a time, right? And like the force of that, what we would call a genre convention, is so strong that it kind of shapes almost unconsciously the way that you tell the story. And I think we have some of those same kind of formal genre conventions around the way that we think about Revelation, and we talk about it from the pulpit, and we record it. And in a way, there's something very beautiful about being willing to unselfishly share a form that will communicate to those that you are speaking to, right? It's a way of unselfishly speaking in a language that will reach your audience, rather than in a way that's going to just demonstrate how brilliant and original and innovative you are, right? Like how unique your spiritual perspective is. So I'll just briefly make a case that there can be a utility sometimes in the forms that we share for thinking about what Revelation is. But you're right that they can be limiting and they can be constraining. And I think that there can be a kind of dynamic tension where we share enough of a shared language for talking about personal revelation and personal experience that we're actually able to communicate with each other, but that there's the flexibility there, and that we can be real and authentic to our experience, and that we can find the words to genuinely describe what it's like to go through the wilderness. I think, that's what Kate wanted to do, I think, was to, and not just, and again, very unselfishly, not so much in her own voice, but through the voice of other women. She's found these narratives from church history, from church leaders, right? Art of Cap. And she's allowed them to show that, it's hard. It's not easy. There are times when the heavens feel silent and closed. And there are times when the obstacles just seem, insuperable. And that's a part of Revelation too. Yeah.
Okay. Tim mentioned the housework chapter. Can we go there? Housework is a crucible of discipleship. This was my favorite chapter for sure. And
really interesting. Sorry, I'm going to let you finish, but just like such an interesting chapter, because we're like sort of like very high level, like
revelation,
truth. Truth, and then it's like housework, and it really grounds the book in a real way.
So I know that I want to hear how that chapter came to be.
This is the one that I know the least about, to be honest. The others originated as speeches. And actually, you can go back to YouTube and you can find oftentimes like a video of her giving the speech that was kind of the germ for each of the other chapters. But this one was not a speech, as far as I know. This was the one that came to us in the least developed form and that needed the most work in understanding what she was trying to say and bringing it into the both things form, and just in building it out with her experience. But it's my favorite. It's my favorite chapter. And I think it is deeply, I think it might come closest to the heart of who Kate was as a person. And it's certainly the most personal of all the chapters, where she very openly shares her own struggles and her own experience. Part of that is that I'll give credit here to the editor, Miranda Wilcox, who discovered a blog that Kate had kept several years ago. And I think is not widely known and wasn't widely read. And we were able to take beautiful, beautiful personal writing in a kind of freer mode than you see it in the other chapters, and incorporate that here into this chapter. But yeah, as I said, Kate's personal life and her professional life were not separate. They were deeply integrated. And she always chose to write about what she loved. She was raised by her mother and her grandmother. She never really knew her father at all, and he was never present in her life at home. So she was raised in a household of women, in a world of women. And so she wanted to write about women's history. She loved the domestic arts and was raised by actually very sporty. Her mom and her grandma were very sporty, but taught her the finer things of domestic life. And so she wanted to not only practice those and enjoy those, but to understand them and to write about them. So she did some professional work on the history of housework as a practice and as a concept. And some of that comes in here. But lots of it is personal. And what she's saying is that she doesn't want to romanticize housework. And it was a burden that she felt very keenly as a working woman with a house full of children. She also was a person who was meticulous in her standards. So her home was gracious and perfect, and she required high levels of order. So you start to see the dilemma here, right? Busy professional life, young children, and yet to function, she needs a clean, beautiful, and orderly place. And she has a strong perfectionistic streak, as she talks about. So she experienced housework both as a joy, but also as a real burden and as a site of inequities in her marriage relationship. And she talks about how this really came to a head after her first initial surgery, when she had an eye removed for the ocular cancer that would eventually kill her. But there was this crisis in her marriage, and she told Sam, I can't and I won't do this anymore. You have got to step up. And she shares very candidly, and Sam has done the same, about how he did step up, and they came to a more equitable and fair and just distribution of labor that allowed everybody in the household to thrive and flourish while maintaining a level of order that she could live with.
Yeah.
So that's one half of it. But the other half of it is that she believes deeply in the goodness of the physical world, the goodness of our bodies, the goodness of the created world. And the reality is that the created world is messy, and it is a place that is ruled by time and decay and gravity. Makes things fall on the floor and get dirty constantly and requires sweeping all the time. And so she wants to see the goodness and the beauty in physical work that engages our body as well as our minds and our spirits. And so she sees housework as one of those realms where we can connect with the divine through our bodies, and we can connect with the divine through our hearts and spirits, because it gives us ample opportunity to negotiate and forgive. So it can be an arena for forgiveness and for practicing higher forms of relation that aren't just, when there's one who's in charge and one who's down here, it's very clear, right? What's much harder is when you've got two equal partners trying to work things out. But housework gives us an opportunity to practice those higher level skills.
Yeah. And she talks about, I think, does she call it a psychological bind? There's some phrase that I thought that I just loved, because and it's this idea that not only is the housework relentless and it's sort of continuous, that there's not really a start and a finish, but also that we have this cultural impression that there's something less than about this work, that there's something less meaningful and important about this work. And so she talks about Mary and Martha. Can you just tell Mary and Martha through her eyes? Because I felt like she illuminated something that even though that story has been painful for me at times, even reading that story, wanting it to mean something else, I couldn't see it until this chapter.
Yeah. So, right. She talks about, I think she has a really funny way of introducing it. I think she says, is there any, this is how she starts this chapter. Which New Testament ghost casts more gloom into the hearts of believing women than any other? More feelings of discouragement, failure, and the impossibility of doing it right? Martha, whose sister is Mary, and whose brother is Lazarus. And later on, she talks about demons. I mean, this genuinely was the site of some of her deepest personal struggles in her marriage and just in her life, in her battles with perfectionism. A lot of it, and anxiety, a lot of it centered around the house and housework and the order of her environment. And I can relate to that. So she says that Martha is remembered unfairly often, right? That she chose the lesser part and was cumbered by many things, whereas Mary chose the better part and chose to sit at the feet of the Savior and listen to him. And so she wants to she wants to push back against that, against the idea that Martha's work was less than. And the way she does that is by using Christ himself as a lens. And she says, look at how Christ spent his time. How often was he worried about food and providing food, aware of people's hunger? This was a big thing that she comes back to often. It's not just the cooking, right? But it's the planning of the meals, and it's the shopping of the meals as well, right? So we don't really see Christ necessarily, preparing food, but he thought about the hunger. He anticipated the hunger. He did the mental and emotional work of being ready and having a plan to feed hungry bodies and then provisioning the supplies that were needed. She talks about him washing the feet, washing bodies. So she shows how Christ himself did housework, was not above that, and dignified that kind of work by taking it on himself.
Yeah. And it really interested me too that there was a part in which she shared that because she and Sam both had very busy professional lives, and the means to do it because of their busy professional lives, that they hired a house cleaner to come, I think she said once a week. And yet she worried that by doing that, she was sort of implicitly valuing what she was doing professionally above housework, even though housework was also a part of her life. So could you talk about how she grappled with that idea?
Yeah. It's true. She, as I said, what she wanted always as an historian in her professional life was to see and dignify people's first-person experience from the inside and show readers from the inside how their life had dignity, how they were striving for a larger purpose, how they had goals and aspirations within their scope. So if that was what she was doing at the office, right, getting inside the experience of people whom history has forgotten, often women, what then did it mean if those actual activities that she is elevating at work in the office, she herself is declining to do herself, right? Because she wants to spend the time in the office. Is she kind of implicitly valuing the life of the mind then over the life of the body, even though ironically, what the life of the mind is doing is valuing the life of the body, right? So she found herself in a bind. She didn't have an answer to it, and neither do I. This is one place where Kate and I had very different perspectives, right? I personally, I'm persuaded by her self-critiques. So Kate and I made different choices in that realm, right? And she, but she felt in the end that was what she needed to do to do the work that she was called to do, and basically to have an environment in which she could function, right? To have that basic level of cleanliness and order that she needed to have the mental peace to do the work that she wanted to do.
And maybe there's another lesson here, which is that in many cases, sort of there is a resolution to these to these tensions, these polarities that are brought up. But maybe this is one where the lesson is this is an unresolved tension, and there is a sort of necessary sitting in it that we may not, and we may not come to a resolution quickly.
Yeah. Maybe we wouldn't have this chapter had she not asked for someone to come and clear out. It's just one more way that we will never at least be able to reconcile it for someone else, but we may come to a place of rest in our own life about the right thing for our own home. My favorite part of this chapter was in the end where she talks about these housework rituals to help her sort of remember gratitude. I've thought about this so much this week and just appreciated that care also, or that, cleaning and all of these things that we do for our house, that's all care that can help us feel grateful for our life and for our home and for these messes that keep making themselves. And I just loved that subtle shift. Shift.
Yeah, me too. This whole area, this whole passage, the end of this chapter, again, is taken liberally from this blog, and you'll hear a different kind of voice come out in here. There's this one line a little before, Aubrey, where I'll read, but she says, "I try not to read gardening books or magazines within 90 minutes of bedtime. They are far too stimulating."
I laughed out loud at this. That was amazing.
Kate was very funny. She had a very delicate and dry wit, and you wouldn't guess it at first because she was just so composed and so poised, but she was very, very funny. And then she goes on to remember these beautiful nights that she would spend as a girl growing up with her mother working outside in the garden. And as many teenage daughters, she didn't value the work that her mother did at that time. And so she would, she didn't feel like being out there working with her mother in the dark in the garden. In fact, she would take the opportunity to watch off-limits television in the house when her mother was out there gardening. But then the perspective shifts. And she says here, "Now I am the one outside after dark, trying to get the early weeding and planting done before the summer heat sets in. My Latter-day Saint neighbor across the street suggested a headlamp for after dark gardening so you can distinguish new plants from young weeds and keep your hands free. Like Adam, I labor by the sweat of my brow, but it is not a curse. It is an opportunity to forgive the ground for its weeds, to seek the succor of heavenly parents, and to revel in the richness of the black earth. Later, I will sweep that dirt from my kitchen floor, and it is all a gift."
Well,
thank you. I love that.
The final chapter of the book is called The Weight of Legacy, and it is a very heavy chapter because as the reader, you know that Kate's life is coming to an end. And so I guess I'm curious about the source material for this chapter and how present the end of her own life was for her as she began to explore these ideas.
Yeah. So the source material for this chapter was actually the Maxwell Institute lecture that she delivered in 2020, the pandemic year. Yeah. So it was a very unusual setting. You can actually go on YouTube and find the video there. She delivered it in a totally empty room. The only people there were herself and Blair Hodges, who was doing the videography, and Melissa Inouye, who introduced her. And they're all masked.
Amazing room.
I know, yeah, an
That's
amazing room there. So that was the original source. And then, as I said, we worked to shape it and to fill it out, and to clarify and make it bigger and stronger. So yeah, in 2020. I don't remember exactly where Kate's health was, but in any case, I think the fact that she had not remained in remission after her initial surgery and treatment. She went into remission for a short while, but then for a number of years after that, she, with incredible stamina and courage, enrolled in several different clinical trials to try experimental treatments to battle the cancer. I think Kate probably knew at that point that her life would be shorter than she wanted it to be. She didn't have a death sentence hanging over her yet at that point in 2020. But nevertheless, as you say, Tim, it took incredible mental and psychological fortitude, I have to believe, to look squarely in the face the reality that her life would be ending, and consider the questions of what might be left after she goes, what might be left for her children and for her husband and for her colleagues, and for her brothers and sisters. And that's what she does here, is she sort of takes a really thoughtful and rigorous look at what should matter in our lives. And as you recall, she starts out citing a Faith Matters podcast, as a matter of fact, where Terrell Givens interviewed a number of Latter-day Saint scholars and asked them what they wanted their obituary to say. So she uses that as a launch point to think about what we should care about leaving after us. And Kate was ambitious. She was deeply unselfish, deeply gracious, but she wasn't self-erasing or self-abnegating, right? She wanted her life to mean something. She had big dreams and big plans and believed in the work that she was doing and thought that she was the person to do it. So she wanted her life to mean something, but she was struggling with the reality that, if scholars measure their lives by the height of the stack of books that they've written, her stack wasn't going to be super duper high, although incredibly rich and incredibly meaningful. And so what she concludes and what she comes to understand was something that she'd understood from the beginning, which is that ultimately, more than the results of the work itself is the process by which you got there, and in particular, the relational process and the ways in which you build up colleagues, in which you mentor young scholars, in her case, in which you build the human capital, we could say, right? The human resources that will persist after you are gone. And the way that she taught them to do their historical work bathed in the light and color of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's a phrase from President Kimball that employees of BYU know very well, because it's our aspiration to teach every topic bathed in the light and color of the gospel. So as we've been talking about, you can see how her respect for every human being as a child of God comes out in her historical method, where her respect for every historian as a child of God comes out in her mentorship, and her sense that the church is true aspirationally to the extent that we make it true by building true relationships. All that comes out in the way that she showed up at work. And she showed up at work extremely competent with that backbone of steel, but always focused on the person, on finding the person who could use mentoring and development and encouragement, sometimes instruction, and showing up where was needed.
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up. But is there anything else that has stayed with you that you want to make sure to mention before we close?
I will. I'll mention one more thing. There's a picture that she loves, that she describes, and we reproduce it. It's by an artist named James Christensen, and it's an image that listeners of an older generation have probably seen. It's this picture of a woman flying, and she's weighted down with all kinds of household objects. But she holds this candle up, and it seems to be leading her up and away into this beautifully rendered purplish blue dusk. And Kate loved that image. She always kept it in her home. And for her, the candle meant revelation. That's how she likens it. But I've reflected on it, and I was thinking recently about the last words that Kate, our last conversation, the last words that I heard in her voice. And it was last summer, unbelievably, in her last week, she was still working. And in fact, she was chairing a meeting of the Maxwell Institute imprint board. And I had held that chairmanship before she did. And so we had the meeting, she led it beautifully. And then the meeting wrapped up and she didn't know what was supposed to happen next. Whom was she supposed to send a memo to and what was supposed to happen next? So she called me and said, I was wondering if you could mentor me on what comes next. And of course, in that moment, I understood it was about the meeting. So I told her, yeah, write a memo to Spencer and et cetera, et cetera. But when I reflected later about those last words that I had heard coming in her very rich and distinctive voice, of course, those words took on a very different meaning. Can you mentor me on what comes next? And I wonder what it was like for her at the very end. She had this remarkable and unshaken faith in another world where she would be reunited with her grandmother and those who had gone before. Did that confidence stay with her until the very end? Did she need, like the woman in the picture, did she need to hold up that candle as an act of courage and faith in the face of a kind of blank sky above? I don't know what it was like for her. I wasn't able ever to mentor her in that regard. As I've said, that's not a kind of spiritual knowledge that is given to me. But it has been truly just the honor of a lifetime to be able to share the light and rest in her assurance and her perspective while giving words to it. There's a kind of beautiful mutual exchange there that I was able to borrow from her faith, and she could borrow from my words to accomplish something really beautiful that I genuinely do. I see this book as the kind of candle that she is holding up as she moved on, and wanted to leave this primarily for her children and for her family and for her friends, but for the body of saints.
Thank you so much, and thank you for helping her amplify that in a way that we get to enjoy the fruits of it too, and to all of the women who participated in this project.
Thanks, Rosalynde.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Rosalynde Welch on Kate Holbrook's new book, Both Things Are True. If Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews, and it really does help us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.